we will get started, and I want to start this conversation by just giving a basic outline of what we talk about and think about when we're looking at sustainable livelihood. And sustainable livelihood, persons would ask, why is it important in the matter of drug policy and drug regulation? And one of the things that we need to remember is it's an approach. Sustainable livelihood is an approach that seeks to improve the livelihood of the poor, of persons in rural or even urban communities that are constrained by factors such as the opportunities that they have and the resources. And we are looking at development. So because of that, sustainable livelihood takes into account the capacity, the assets they have, the means they have to survive. And with the word sustainable, how do we strengthen and keep these opportunities, provide these opportunities? Key to sustainable livelihood is also the people. So it's people-centered, it's responsive and participatory in its nature. It's multi-level, so it has the private sector involvement, it has the government involvement, and it also is dynamic. It changes with the policies and the processes. So you look at laws, you look at regulations, you look at culture, which is important to that change, and how we are able to sustain the living standards of the communities which are involved. And that is critical from a drug policy component, especially in areas in society such as the Caribbean and Latin America, Asian and African countries, where a lot of the standard of living and the livelihood of the communities are built around things that are called illicit crops, such as cannabis in Caribbean region, coca, opium poppy in other areas. So where we are concerned, our conversation here is to bring to the fore, and we have assembled a good mix of speakers who will give not only theoretical framework for how we operate, but research, will bring research to bear on the conversation and will bring lived experience to the matter of sustainable livelihood as it concerns drugs and drugs policy. Without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing our first presenter, and our first speaker comes to us with a wealth of research experience. He's Professor Jonathan Goodhand, who is Professor in Conflict and Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And Professor Goodan has been investigating forward drugs and disorder in countries such as Myanmar. And Professor Goodhand will give us a basic understanding of research that has been done that looks at the global challenges that is generated from these illicit drug economies. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Professor Goodhand to come in and just give us this presentation.
Thank you very much, everybody, and it's great to be part of this really excellent seminar series, which I've been following over the last few weeks, and I think it's it's a really exciting initiative with a great diversity of speakers. So I'm going to say something about some of the research we have been doing, and just to start this off. We all know that there's this emerging policy consensus around the need to desecuritize and to developmentalize drugs issues and to align them with the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we are seeing, and this webinar is a symptom of that, an intensifying and growing conversation between drug policymakers, drug agencies, and development policymakers and agencies. And it's kind of around this issue. A lot of the debates are around this question of the drugs development nexus. And that's what really I'm going to be focusing on in my 8 minutes now, drawing on the findings from our research project called Drugs and Disorder, Building a Sustainable Political Economy of Peace in the Aftermath of War. Next slide, please, Tess. And we're doing research in 3 countries, in borderland areas of these 3 countries, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Colombia. And it's longitudinal research with borderland communities involved in illicit drug production, trafficking, and consumption. And I guess one of the key messages that is coming out of this research is this drugs development nexus. There is no fixed or unidirectional relationship between drugs and development. It's extremely complex, it's two-way, and it's a deeply contextualized relationship. So we want to critique ideas in the next slide, please, which are shown in this idea of a kind of a vicious circle and virtuous circle of drugs. And the idea that development is somehow, the absence of development is kind of causally related to drug economies, and development itself can be an antidote to these drug economies and lead to a more virtuous cycle of good governance, sustainable livelihoods, and so forth. Go on to the next slide, please. So we want to unpack this relationship between drugs and development. And we can broadly see 4 different kinds of relationships that we're exploring in our research. The first one is one you'll all be familiar with, and I won't elaborate really here because it's well recognized, and that is that the global war on drugs has these deleterious effects on people's livelihoods, on stability, on people's health, and creates a permissive environment for human rights abuses. And that is one of the things that has driven this conversation between development agencies and drugs agencies to find alternatives to this model. So the second and much more contentious, I think more interesting relationship is about the impact of illicit drugs on development in borderland regions. This is quite a contentious and politically charged question. It's frequently asserted, as in that kind of vicious and virtuous cycle model, that drug economies undermine and distort development. And yet our research is showing a more complex and counterintuitive picture. We know that in Afghanistan, drug economies provide a safety net for poor rural households, which in many ways is far more far-reaching and pro-poor than official development efforts. We found in Colombia that coca cultivation can be a source of social advancement for peasants living in remote frontier regions. Not only does it allow them to prosper on an individual level, but it also leads to investment in public goods like education, like infrastructure, like healthcare. And also surprisingly, we've found that coca cultivation is far more equitable in gender terms than other sectors of the agrarian economy. And our Colombian research team, led by Francisco Gutierrez Sanning, argues actually coca is the alternative development. It provides an escape route from poverty for many households. Now, that's not to say there are not downsides to illicit economies. And our research shows, for example, in Colombia, that the coca economy is linked to very high levels of violence, while in Myanmar, in borderland areas of Shan State and Kachin State, drug economies are linked to also growing drug use within the Shan and Kachin communities, which has also very important developmental effects. Well, what we're trying to argue here is that we need to be aware of the danger of simplistic narratives about drugs and to recognize that they are also a source of innovation, of ingenuity, and of rapid transformations within borderland societies. Thirdly, there's the impact of development processes themselves on drug economies. And again, that the mainstream narrative is that development is somehow an antidote to illicit drugs. That if borderland regions are better integrated, if markets and state building processes are rolled out into these regions, drug production will automatically decrease. And what we're seeing in all three countries is actually that peace processes and increased development efforts have been associated with the expansion of illicit drug economies. So in Myanmar, ceasefires and post-war reconstruction and development booms have gone on alongside a booming drug economy. So our research suggests that perhaps there may be some kind of relationship between the forms of development that are going on and this expansion of drug economies. What it's showing us is that extractive and exploitative forms of development have pushed marginal communities into a closer relationship with illicit drugs. Fourthly, we've also looked at the impacts of supposedly kind of more benign, more developmental approaches to drugs, including alternative livelihoods, and something today we're discussing is around legalization or regulation. Now, one of the critiques of militarized and criminalized approaches, characteristic of the war on drugs, has led to this search for alternatives, more human-centered approaches. And I want to give two quick examples of some of the potential downsides of seemingly more benign approaches. Firstly, in all three countries, and we'll probably discuss this more in the discussion, have highlighted the limitations of alternative developments in creating alternative livelihoods for illicit drug producers.
Yeah, very good example.
There's no illicit alternative crop and livelihood that can be easily found to replace cocoa or poppy. It fails to recognize the embeddedness of drug economies in social and market relations in the borderlands. These economies are absolutely central to managing shocks, accessing credit, to getting access to land and so on. And alternative livelihood programs have not been sufficiently integrated into a broader package of measures. And in many cases, they have immiserated peasant communities and antagonized already conflictual state-society relations. And one other example is to maybe to have more discussion about later is about legalization. What would legalization mean in a country like Afghanistan? Essentially, it will be experienced as a massive and traumatic shock, because for a country like Afghanistan, illegality is their main comparative advantage. And it's the illegality of drugs that keeps the price high. So a kind of global regulation would have a huge shock on the economy. A more kind of tailored form of legalization would open up and create new business opportunities, but these would be seized by entrepreneurs and marginalized smaller farmers. So I think we need here to think about the perspectives of producer countries and borderland communities in these debates. They have been largely missing in many of the discussions around the relationship between drugs and development. So last slide, and I'll finish now. So just to finish off, we see this as a kind of a very deeply contextualized and complex kind of relationship. We need to be wary of these win-win narratives. All good things do not come together, and drugs and development involve a lot of trade-offs and uneven costs and benefits for different actors in these processes. We need to think carefully about these distribution effects. Finally, we need to bring in more of the marginal voices into these discussions. And finally, to say that in the discussion I've seen in these webinars so far, there's been quite a lot of discussion about how we need to reform drug policies and to align them to development sets of goals. In many ways, I think this is too uncritical of development. It lets development off the hook. As our research is showing, the model of development which is being enacted in many of these borderland areas is pushing people into a closer relationship with illicit economies. And so we therefore need to think about reforming development efforts as well as drug policy in order to achieve a more optimal alignment between the two. And the final thing to say is to go back to the first webinar. there are many blocks to action which have got nothing to do with evidence, and they're to do with the blind spots and interests of development agencies themselves. And I think we need to have a better analysis of what those blocks and blind spots are and how best to target them. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Jonathan Goodhand. That's very comprehensive presentation, and we look forward to the questions later. We'll move now into our second presenter, which will follow for the research that was done by Professor Jonathan Goodhand, because Pien Metaal brings to us, and from the advocacy point of view and the work that she has done at TNI, Transnational Institute, which has focused on the networking and the education of the traditional farmers of illicit cultivation, whether it is in the Caribbean, Asia, Latin America. She comes to us with a wealth of experience from the Drugs and Democracy program of TNI, which has had to work closely with these traditional communities. And so I know, for example, she had done some work with the cultivators of illicit crops who in early 2015 had done a declaration on these prohibited crops. He will tell us more of that conversation and put it in perspective with where it concerns the sustainable livelihood of these traditional growing communities across the world. Without further ado, Pien Metaal, over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to allow me to share some thoughts about this topic. Indeed, I will focus on the communities that grow coca, opium, poppy, and cannabis in order to sustain their livelihoods as the basic providers of the drug trade. The resource material for the drug trade. This webinar is about livelihoods for the drug trade, and of course there are many actors in this trade, but I will focus on those that grow the plants. TNI in the drugs program, going back 25 years, has always sought to research and to bring out the story from the field, so standing next to the farmers, to the policy level. So we have been working with farmers from the very beginning of our program, and the initiatives that TNI has taken addressed fundamental issues around illicit crop cultivation and resources. So we have been helping to defend the human rights, traditional use, and the inequalities under the current drug prohibition system. And also sought to find ways to represent the farmer's voice into this international drug policy system, where farmers are being criminalized, prosecuted, and imprisoned. Indeed, we worked in different geographical locations, and we have always tried as an institute to connect these discussions to broader issues on global justice and trade and development opportunities of the global south. So I will just pass through a basic thoughts about what the conditions and circumstances are that have led certain communities to grow coca or cannabis or opium poppy, and what this means in terms of sustaining themselves and their families and their communities, and what distinguishes them from others that grow bananas or coffee or other agricultural crops. Basically, more than a livelihood, it is referring to subsistence. The majority of the communities that grow the plants are living in marginalized and abandoned areas. They have been subject to non-inclusive modernization processes in their countries, where the rural versus the urban have played out in their disadvantage. Uh, Big poverty and subsistence issues and few development options. So most people that are involved in this cultivation come from this kind of circumstances. The issue of land, the access to land and control of resources in many of the places where these crops grow, there are conflicts around who controls the resources and who has access to them. Another issue that is of vital importance to understand why and how these communities grow their crops is are the consequences of the globalization of the agricultural production and the economies of scale. We are talking about small communities with little means to access land and little means to organize themselves because of the illicity of the plants that they grow. And last but not least, it's the pre-existing cultural, ceremonial, and medicinal use of these plants that have existed for ages. And um, according to a change in the domination of cultural values, having caused a lot of confusion and discrimination of indigenous peoples using these plants. So this all was very much impacted by the global legal framework once the UN decided in 1961 to control and to put strict controls on the cultivation of these plants and even declared the disappearance and the non-viability of these traditional uses. Um, the international community has offered uh, from the very beginning the concept of alternatives and the replacement of crops for other crops, um, but has not achieved much. As we know, the problem still exists after, says 60 years later, the amount of illicit crop has not decreased very much. So the new rules that came up in 1961 for cultivation and on these plants have led to a repressive system. And at the same time, there has been a recognition of the connection between these two. So sustainable development and the global drug trade has been recognized by all the UN agencies involved in these issues. Um, I can read from the World Drug Report of 2016, where this relationship has been recognized. And um, yeah, well, I won't because there's not much time. But
Yeah,
basically, it is it is recognized that this connection exists. So being an alternative to the alternative is for many communities not a real option. We have, as Vicky said, been organizing lots of meetings to hear what the farmers' experiences have been with these projects. And basically, with a few exceptions, the majority of these projects have failed and have failed to address the basic issue of development. Um, we think that,
yeah,
so answering the question, does alternative development approach support the sustainable development of participating communities in state where it has been implemented? I think it has not. I mean, there's not much evidence to show that it has actually led to any sustainable development. Many projects were short term. They were also implemented from above, not with the participation of the affected communities, and have failed to address the real issues beneath the problems that occur in these areas. Um,
excellent point.
okay, so well, finally, I don't know. I have no idea. Vicky, I only will address a few points about how I think or how we think that legal regulation could benefit these traditional farmers communities. Of course, um, increasing the opportunities for a sustainable livelihood. Living from the land as a small-scale farmer is very difficult anyways, even if you have, and even with bananas or coffee. And of course, this is an expression of this crisis of the agriculture, small-scale agriculture in the world. So any solutions for this problem will have to address the broader context of development options for small-scale agricultural producers in the world.
Yeah, and I
Removing, of
think
course,
we, yeah,
huh?
I think we will this flesh
We will
those out
discuss
some
this,
more,
but
right, in the,
just yeah, just a few more points, and I will end it. Being illegal makes things very difficult to have a sustainable livelihood. So that would be the first step. I mean, regulating would of course mean more options for sustainability for these farmers. Um, it would also help that there should be a recognition that the use of these plants is and can be beneficial to the people who use them in the majority of the cases, and some kind of preferential access to emerging markets of these plants. In the case of cannabis, that's very clear because that's already occurring. Uh, that it would that these communities would have access to a preferential scheme or have special provisions so that they have the opportunity to participate in this trade. Um, Having borne the brunt of the repression for so many decades, it is only logical to give them some kind of beneficial position in these newly emerging markets.
yeah,
So I think that I'll leave it with that, and
yeah.
looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, we will discuss those points further. To give us a different perspective and a perspective from a ministerial government position, our third speaker, presenter, Miguel Samper Strouss, who is from Colombia and has done work as he's a Colombian lawyer, and he has done work as a director of transitional justice at the Ministry of Justice in Colombia from 2010 to 2012, and he has worked extensively on the issue of land rights and at the National Land Agency in Colombia as the general director from 2016 to 2018. And today he is part of an advisory firm, Gestation Rural Integral, which is critical in helping the traditional communities who have been in the cultivation of uh, coca and cannabis in Colombia. Now, he brings to us that other perspective, the perspective from the government, the regulatory point of view. So over to Miguel, who will give us some insight on sustainable livelihood from a ministerial government perspective and the experience in Colombia. Miguel?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation to be part of this very interesting and very needed webinar series. And I'm going to talk about how property rights are right now in Colombia, how the legal rights of peasant communities and traditional communities are organized in Colombia, to see if there is a connection with those property rights and the coca cultivation, the coca plantations that are right now in our country. And at the end, I'm going to sustain that Colombia's government has had two big milestones, and right now has a third possibility to consider the opportunities in terms of rural development and of fostering property rights in rural areas with the cocoa plantations and the cannabis plantations, and to see how these opportunities we could have seen them from the government as opportunities and not as challenges as we saw them. So to start, how are the legal relations of land right now in Colombia? As you can see in the chart, right now only 21% of the rural communities, of rural families, have the property rights, the full rights over the land they work at. There's another 20% of tenures of land that they know they are leasing that land. They will never become property right owners of the land. So they don't have that expectative of becoming owners. But there's a huge 60%, 6 out of 10 families here in Colombia, they don't own the land they work at. So this is because it's a private land, but they don't have the titles of that, because we have here in Colombia a strong tradition of passing the land from hand to hand in an informal way, or because they are occupying public land, which we call a baldío. Next slide, please. And this is how the map of informality in property land rights looks like. So it's widespread across the country. We have concentration of informality in some parts of the country. And if you compare it with the next slide I'm going to present, can you please pass it? There you can see the permanence of coca. This was a study carried out by the Observatory of Illicit Crops for a period of over 12 years. You can see that the concentration of coca cultivations in some parts of the country, especially in the Southwest, coincide with the informality map, but that's not always the case. I mean, the red part, which have a permanent coca cultivation, is not always goes in the same direction of informality in property rights. Of course, you have to take in mind that you have to bear in mind that here in Colombia, our goal for 20 or more years has always been how to eradicate coca cultivation. We have never posed the question on how to create rural development working with the families that right now are growing coca cultivations, coca plantations in our country. And I think that's a big question, and that's the question we should have asked for many years here in Colombia, because if your objective is to eradicate coca, then you're not going to look at the advantages of creating and fostering these communities' conditions for rural development. And next slide, please. That's what you can see, where this is our cadastral information right now. We have tried for many years to update that cadastral information, but right now, 70% of the Colombian territory is outdated, because we have never tried to get to these territories and work with them in order to update the cadastral information, which is a primary requisite to formalize land property rights over those territories. Only 2.3%, and that's a very, very, very shame figure to share with you. Only 2.3% of the rural areas of the country has the cadastral information updated. And there's a huge 30% in which we don't know where's there. I mean, we have never formed the cadastral information in 30% of our country. That's a huge challenge for many years. And if we want to implement rural development, truly strong rural development policies in these parts of the country, we have to start to form that cadastral information. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we have had two milestones, recent milestones, to transform and to pose the question as it should have been. The first one is when we regulated from the National Drug Council the cannabis, the grow and production of cannabis for medicinal purposes. We there have a discussion between years 2014 and 2015 about what should we do with the cannabis plantations that are already in place in Colombia but are illicit, of course. And due to some pressures, outside pressures, foreign pressures, mainly from the United States, we had to exclude those plantations from the possibility of becoming allies of the government with the proper licenses and with the proper regulations, becoming allies of the government in generating conditions for rural development. So we had to pass by that opportunity to give a hand to these peasant communities that were already implementing or already cultivating cannabis, and we left them aside of the whole regulation. We had to tell them to eradicate your plantation and start over with the process before growing again cannabis. The second milestone was a peace agreement, because the peace agreement stated very clear with the peace agreement with the mobilized FARC group. We stated very clear that we will not going to criminally pursue the farmers that were growing coca. And we had this huge opportunity to tell them to become part again with the government of the rural development. But we created at the National Land Agency this program that was called Formalized for Substitution, in which we render the legal property rights, the deeds of a land plot, to peasants that used to grow coca. And we didn't include, because we had the same discussion, we didn't include the peasants that were growing coca at the time, so they couldn't become part of this program. And we carry out this study, which I'm present you the big findings of this study. What would happen in terms of development if we could legalize, if we could formalize the property rights of only 200,000 peasants? And as you can see there, the food production increases, the rural infrastructure increases, the access to credit almost doubles, and the average income of those families also almost doubled if we could formalize those property rights. So with this, I will end my presentation. So the question right now we're facing is that what should we do with these rural areas? If we want them to take part in the rural development, if we want them to implement measures of sustainable livelihood, we should stop considering them as illicit families that grow coca and that we should eradicate them, but we should engage them as the basic measure for fostering rural development, and allow them to be part of these governmental programs. If we do so, we have also a third milestone, which is the pandemic effects. We are all looking for innovative measures to reactivate our economy. And in these places, as Catatumbo or as in Tumaco, if we let them be and we support them, I'm pretty sure that they are going to reactivate their economy, their local economy, in a much faster way than any other rural areas in the country.
We look forward to having conversations on that point, because we do have some questions treating to that. Our fourth and fifth speakers are from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And we are talking about communities, but we also have to include in our conversation, participation, persons who have the lived experience of growing these crops, of working with these crops. So we have with us Junior Spirit Cottle, who is the president of the Cannabis Revival Committee, which is a growing committee, a committee of farmers, traditional cannabis farmers within the Caribbean. And he comes to us with the experience of having been through alternative development projects, as well as growing and being a part of that growing community. And right after him, coming in after him, will be Katita Lenora Harry, who is a traditional, and what is special, she's a female traditional cannabis farmer who has over 23 years of experience of growing the crop, of going to the mountains, of being in this industry before and after the regulation. So we will now have these persons giving you the lived experience from the Caribbean perspective of growing cannabis. So we'll start off with Spirit, who will take us through the AD projects in St. Vincent, and then we'll try to smoothly hand over to Katia, who will give us the experience as a traditional farmer. So Spirit.
A pleasant good morning, good evening, good night to all our listeners. I want to begin by saying cannabis in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and by extension in our region, has been illegal from as far as I can remember. Indeed, cannabis has been illegal even before I was born. In fact, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is the second largest producer of cannabis, second to Jamaica in the Caribbean. And by the region, by the Caribbean, I mean the community of nations that are called CARICOM. But interestingly, today we are the region's largest supplier. And that has been going on for the past 3 or so decades. I will even go further to say that St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that we are one of the largest producers of cannabis in the world, if we are guided by the size of our country, which is just about 150 square miles, and the size of our population, which is about just over 100,000. Conservative estimates put our traditional cultivators to around 2,500 persons. And this does not include many urban youths who travel to the mountains in order to assist in the preparation of the lands and in the cleaning of cannabis at harvest time. And you know, out of this has come an economic partnership and a strong social bond between both parties, which I would say augurs well strategically for the future. Not to mention the contribution of cannabis to our own national economy, albeit in an unofficial way. Traditional cultivators and our urban dwellers, in reality, many of them depend principally on cannabis for their means of livelihood. In 1998, the prominence of St. Vincent and the Grenadines on the cannabis front as a cultivator of cannabis led to the first major cannabis eradication exercise led by the American DEA in conjunction with the regional security forces. they came at the peak of our harvest, which was eradicated, and our farmers suffered. The following year, crime increased in the affected communities. Led by a committee of marijuana farmers, cannabis activists, urban consumers, Rastafarians, hundreds of cannabis growers protested against the eradication. We called for an end to the eradication. We called for alternative development. We called on the then Prime Minister for discussion on the matter. Subsequently, in 2001, the Ministry of Agriculture established a program called the Integrated Forest Management and Development Project, with the aim of protecting our forests, which was being denuded as a result of marijuana cultivation, while providing alternative livelihood for growers. Traditional growers became part of the process. Traditional growers were employed in reforestation the lands, but then things didn't work out as planned, and it was not sustainable. And this left many of our growers no other option. Today, we do hope with the modern medical cannabis industry that we are embarking on, that our forests will be better protected, that our environment will be better protected, and sustainability will be realized. Certainly, we cannot talk about sustainability without talking about building the capacity of our people. Have left a lot to be desired in this respect. Many of us cannot read nor write. Many of us are functionally illiterate. Many of us lack computer skills, all of which are necessary if we are to withstand the pressures from big business who wants to take over the cannabis industry. But we are resilient. And we will be resilient until our last breath. There's some issues I want to raise, like the issues of our herbalists. Our herbalists who currently make cannabis medicine. We had the regulations, we had the laws to protect them. It's one of the issues that the policymakers have to look at. Issues like security within the framework of the new medical cannabis industry. We can expect foreign investors to have their lands properly secured. They have the monies to buy their cameras. They have their monies to hire security personnel. What about the traditional cultivators? They are looked upon with suspicion. They are not given license to protect to carry firearms to protect their crops. They cannot afford the sort of security services that are required. These are some of the issues we must look at. The issue of alternative development again. I remember very early when we first called for alternative development. We look at it from the perspective of substituting cannabis for some other crop. But today we must look at it in a different light. It must involve cannabis medicine. It must involve the consumption of cannabis itself. These are some of the issues we must look at. I must also look again at our forests. The deforestation that takes place in our mountains, particularly a country like this. The impact as on our watershed, our domestic water, The water that we drink, sometimes it causes all kinds of diseases among our little ones. These are some of we must look at. Finally, unless we involve those who are affected in the consultation from a very early stage in navigating the process forward, it's not going to work. Thank you.
Very good point. Very good point, Spirit. We will now have Katia to tell us of her own experience as a traditional female ganja or cannabis farmer up in the hills of St. Vincent.
Hey,
Over
good
to you.
afternoon, good night, good morning. Yes, my debate will be on the circumstances and the challenges that that I face for the past couple of years being an illegal traditional farmer. For instance, number one, it's a very, very risky task. For instance, the distance where we travel to plant it, because you can't plant it close because of the police system. So we have to choose way up in the mountain, up under the last software area. And it wasn't an easy task for me as a single mother at times, because at a certain point in time in my life, I am single and I have a daughter, I have a home to take care of. And, going to the mountain as a female, it was very challenging for me, as I said. Currently, I am so happy about the Medical Cannabis Authority legalizing the marijuana. And I am thankful for Dr. Gonsalve and the MCA team in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who is working very hard to get this thing on stream, right? There are a lot of us don't have patience in life as young people, because I try to encourage other person, even at my age and younger than me, to be a part of it, but it seems to be like a lot of them lack of patience. Because in my community, we don't have a working class community. Most people go to the mountain. That is where we get living from, the mountain, right? And as I said earlier on, it is not an easy task. Sometimes, as an illegal farmer, the police are always out. We have to take chances. Sometimes you might have a bill high. You might say, you go in the mountain now, you bring down a little pound or 2 pounds to sell, to pay a bill. And on top of that, you get caught by the police, and that bring down some extra stress in our life. And sometimes make us feel so depressed and don't know what else to do, because we don't have no other alternative. We don't have skill training in our community and stuff like that to uplift our community. So most of the time, it's like everybody now have to just base in the mountain. So what I will add to this is that I'm very grateful for this opportunity and for being a part of this program, and that it will help develop our community, help provide jobs, because our people is a hard work to work, and I am so happy that we get this opportunity so that it could help develop our livelihood, our families, our communities. And I'm very happy to be a part of this.
Thank you, Katia, for telling us of your own experience in traveling to the mountains to survive, to create a livelihood for yourself and your family. We have 2 general questions that I'd like to just ask quickly our panelists to zero in on, and then we will go to the questions from our Q&A. But there are two critical questions, and I think Spirit and Pien and even Professor Goodan, Jonathan had zeroed in on as it relates to alternative development. But I wanted to hear just a little general more on these two questions. And the first is, does the alternative development approach to drug crop cultivation in the various regions, and we have been to the various regions, support a sustainable development of participating communities such as the one that Pien is from, in which they are implemented? So does the alternative development approach support sustainable development in these communities? And secondly, given that there are moves to regulate or change the regulatory framework in several countries for these crops, given the regulatory changes in the various countries, what are the possibilities to include sustainable livelihood in the framework and the process for these communities who cultivate drug crops? And we're looking at it in the stance of the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN have put out there for various countries. So I let us start the way we started with Professor Jonathan Goodhand, and then we'll get a response quickly from Pien, Miguel, and Spirit and Pien. So Jonathan, quickly, your quick response to those two concerns.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, good, difficult question. I mean, the first thing to say is our research project is studying different forms of intervention, of which alternative development, alternative livelihoods is one. But we can't claim to have fully finished this research, and in fact, it's been interrupted by the COVID situation. But we are doing case studies across the 3 countries of different AD programs and how they're implemented. And I guess the first thing to say is it's difficult to talk generically about this because obviously every context is different. But I think there is, this wider critique of alternative development. First of all, people argue about whether we should even call it alternative development, and we should be talking about development in generically, why alternative? So there's a problem about this kind of, in a way, boutique development approach. That's the set of assumptions that you can find an alternative crop which is more profitable to be substituted for illicit crops. And it's based upon a very limited understanding of how drugs play this multifunctional role in people's livelihoods, and how they manage risk, how they get access to credit, how they get access to land, how they lubricate political relationships, and how this is an intergenerational phenomenon that is really become entangled with every aspect of people's lives. So to try and identify a magic bullet alternative is just misunderstanding the nature of these economies. There's a whole range of other kind of lessons that I'm sure others, Pien will be able to come up to also identify as all sorts of problems around coordination, around sequencing, around in Colombia, we've had our University National team looking at the Pien program, which is the drug substitution program that was linked to the peace agreement. And basic argument they make there is that the farmers have kept their part of the bargain, but the government hasn't kept theirs, and they've not delivered on the promises around rural development, around security and livelihoods and so on. So and their finding is not that this could never have worked. They say it could work and it could still work. So it's just in this case, it was an absence of political will and delivery. So I think that we have to really look at what works in different contexts and why, and to draw lessons from that. So there's a lot more to say on this subject. On sustainable livelihoods. Okay, I think there's one thing that we're trying to do in our project is to be clear about what we mean by development, and there is the kind of the big D development, which is development as this historical process of change linked to the expansion of capitalism, the growth of markets, the creation of new classes. And this is often a very kind of brutal and violent process that's going on, and we can see this in our borderland countries, borderland spaces. And then there's this discourse around planned developments of sustainable development, and I think there's a bit of a disconnect between these two, and we need to think about the kind of the more structural things that are preventing sustainable development and sustainable livelihoods from.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. All right, quickly, Pien, in less than a minute, just give me your idea.
Thank you very much. Okay, I addressed the first question already in my presentation, because to our knowledge and to our experience and what we have seen and heard from people who have been participating in these AD projects, focused on substituting the plans with other plans, have been very few successful examples, flaws in the design, in the implementation, in the participation of the beneficiaries, a whole list of things that did not work, longer time. It's not for nothing that these people grow these plans, because other plans are difficult to market. There's an issue of accessibility, etc., etc. So I would say that the experience of alternative development without the prohibited plans is not a big success, and we would argue that any sustainable answer to this phenomena should involve development with these plans. So an alternative development with cannabis, with coca, and with opium, trying to find alternative markets to address livelihoods of the people who grow them. This is a minute, but I mean, I can say much more, but I'll leave it with that.
But you haven't answered part two, which is the second part of the question, speaking about the sustainable development goals and this approach, now that we are looking at regulation of the crops.
Yeah. I mean, there is now an emerging market of cannabis, medicinal cannabis, which is just one small part of cannabis consumption in the world. The market is much bigger for recreational use. Development would involve in a sustainable way the regulation of all sorts of uses of these plants, not just the medical one. And of course, for coca and opium, there are no such possibilities yet. So it will all depend on how the discussion will evolve around opening these markets for traditional use of these or uses of these natural plants in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you. Miguel, any comments? Okay. All right. Moving on. Oh, Miguel, you're here?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, I'm here. Well, as I mentioned during my presentation, I think is how you draft public policy. It's a question of how do you include our numbers. This because I think we have a great opportunity to see how local economies can reactivate if you work with them, even if they have right now illicit crops over their lands. And we have tried everything here in Colombia, as Pien and Professor Goodhand said. We have tried everything. And the recidivism, the people that participate in these programs, voluntary or forced programs, that grow again coca, are a proof of the failure of the scheme, how they are formulated, these public policies. For example, well, aerial spraying, of course, takes the lead always. If you pass a plane and throw glyphosate over there, then you are going to see new plantations in 95% of the cases. If you forcibly eradicate that cultivation, you're going to see 75% of those cultivations being grown again in 6 months, in a 6 months period. Alternative development, as conceived here in Colombia, you can also see how more than 40% of those families are going to grow again coca in a couple of years. And when we started this program of land formalization for substitution, we have, in a period of 3 years, 0% of families growing coca again. So this program, what shows us is that if you include these families from the beginning, and if you allow families that right now are growing coca to become part of the rural development, then you're going to have a sustainable, providing livelihood to these families.
Thank you, Miguel. Spirit, any comments from your own experience on that? Quickly, again, you have a minute and a half.
Vicky, one thing we must understand: alternative development cannot be imposed upon people. People must be given the opportunity to choose for themselves, and that is a fundamental mistake we have been making all the while. We must always remember that our people are our greatest resources. Those who are affected most, you must engage them. Engage them in the discussion, hear what they want, listen to what they have to say. Another thing is that within the legal framework we are developing right now, I think the opportunity is good for us to create an alternative way based on cannabis in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Lands are currently being looked at to make available to our growers. That is a very important step, and we hope with this development.
All right, thank you, Spirit.
We will have a genuine alternative.
Thank you. We will now go to some of the questions from our Q&A, our audience. I have the first question up, and this one is for you, Professor Goodhand. It's coming from Charles Kamahu in Kenya, who wants to know, how do we strike a balance between a respect for human rights and ensuring economic development in these cultivating communities?
Okay, it's an excellent question. I'll try and be disciplined and quick. It needs a longer answer, but I haven't got time. I mean, the first thing is in some ways, there is not a trade-off between rights and economic development, so they can work together. And you know, the war on drugs creates a permissive environment for human rights abuses, and it targets particular communities. It stigmatizes particular communities, and so a human rights discourse and approach which protects people from this kind of policy instruments can both protect people's livelihoods and also their political voice. And what we're hearing from a lot of the people that we're dealing with in Borderlands is that they feel the absence of this voice and the lack of ability to make claims upon the state. And in Colombia, there's been a massive uptick in the assassination of social leaders who are advocating for the rights of coca farmers and their political voice. So the two can go together. Now, where I think there's a trade-off is in the area, particularly around armed conflict and bringing an end to violence. And we've talked about a drugs development nexus, but we actually think there's a nexus between drugs development and peace. And so, for example, the ending of violence may be required to develop kind of bargains, deals, political coalitions between elites who have been involved in the drug trade and allowing them to hold on to their ill-gotten gains, if you like. And there is a trade-off between a human rights-based approach and bringing an end to violence. And I guess we just need to recognize those kind of trade-offs and be explicit about them, rather than pretending that all good things do come together, because they sometimes they can work together and sometimes they don't.
Yeah, thank you very much. The other question from our audience speaks, and this is a relevant and current question. It says, is there already any information on how the current COVID-19 pandemic is affecting small-scale farmers of coca, poppy, cannabis in the borderlands of Colombia, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and the global drug trade overall? So, and this comes to us from Nick Merce, and he said, if such studies have been done, what are the findings? So this is a general question to the panelists. I don't know who wants to take it first. Spirit, you being a cannabis farmer, small-scale cannabis farmer, what is the impact of COVID so far on the cannabis community there?
You want me to answer that, Ricky?
Yes. What is the impact?
It has impacted. It has been impacting significantly on us. In terms of the illegal trade, the impact is very much felt. Borders are closed, persons are being held, caught by the interdicting parties. In terms of the legal industry, we can't ship cannabis, we have passed the laws, but investors are supposed to be coming here to invest in the industry, can't travel. So it has impacted gravely upon us, illegally and legally.
Okay.
That is
so I think that's a good answer coming from the ground up. We have another question from our audience. Someone wants to know, I think this is Javier. Javier wants to know, how do we ensure that the legal regulations do not become a barrier, or how do we ensure that legal regulation becomes sustainable development for the growing communities, considering the risk of corporate capture? So now we have a legal regulation, but how do we prevent corporate capture from because of this? I'll throw this out. Pien, I'll start with you first, and then probably go back to Spirit, his own experience there in St. Vincent. Okay. All right. So we're not getting Pienas yet. So Spirit, St. Vincent, give us your experience.
Well, how do we ensure that? By educating our people, by mobilizing our people, by organizing our people, by sending a message to the policymakers to let them know that we have suffered enough. We have been suffering all the years, and we must be included in the process in a very significant way, not as appendices, but as in a way that we will get real benefit. Indeed, we think that traditional cultivators must be first benefactors of this process of the medicinal cannabis industry.
Katia, any comments from you as a traditional grower, your own view on this? Having the big companies coming over and taking over and pushing out persons like yourself who have been in the industry from before it was legal to now it is legal. What is your own thing?
Well, I will say, okay, what should I say on this one? Repeat the question for me, please, eh?
Is there a way, how do you feel about big companies coming in and taking over the industry now that it has been made legal?
How do I feel about the big companies taking over the industry? Well, I want, I feel a way personally. Once they do the, okay, for instance, the people who coming in to to invest in the cannabis. Well, I heard they spoke about they could employ other persons and stuff like that. I myself want to do my own cultivation, and once everybody get a fair share, once they deal with us with justice, they not try to rob us, stuff like that, I won't have a problem. That I don't really feel no difference.
Professor Goodhand, any feedback you can give to us on that? Because there's a real, whether it is cannabis, in some states, I know persons have pushed for certain crops to remain illegal because they do not want it to be taken over by big corporate entities. What's your own research experience on the ground in the borderlands? What's the feeling there, whether it's cannabis, whether it's opium, poppy, or coca?
Well, I guess I'm struggling because corporate capture doesn't seem like the right term to capture the kinds of processes that we're seeing in the borderlands, certainly of Afghanistan, where corporations wouldn't want to go within wouldn't want to touch. But I mean, what is something that I find interesting coming out of the Colombia research is the argument that the coca economy, although it is violent, in many ways it's more egalitarian than other parts of the economy, including cattle ranching and oil companies and so on. And similarly in Myanmar, where we see very extractive forms of development based on foreign capital, often Chinese capital linked to jade mining and also commercial agriculture. So in some ways, the illicit economies are providing a form of protection and social safety nets. So taking that away just opens up the vulnerability of communities in environments which are, if you like, very extroverted. They're linked into global trade, although it may be very informal. It may be licit, only semi-licit. So I guess the lessons of corporate capture from elsewhere are interesting in the sense that if bigger players come in, then it's going to be the marginal actors in this marketplace who will lose out and get pushed out of the process.
Yeah, most definitely. Yes, Spirit, you wanted to have another comment?
One thing we must recognize is that corporate interest is an international force. And it is important that we take our struggles beyond the national borders, that there be international solidarity from Europe, from Africa, from Asia. There must be that international coming together in order to exert some pressures on the powers that be, if we are to be successful. We must be united. Must be united.
Most definitely. that's a very good point, because one of the things we have to realize is that part of cooperation, we have to find a balance in which both the small farmer and the corporation exist. So it's a very good point to us. Let me thank you all for a very fruitful discussion. Miguel had to leave before, so he apologized for us as well. It's really good that we continue this discussion. This is actually the 5th of our discussion series. Our next discussion, next webinar series, will look at the very important climate change and legalization. And I think Miguel mentioned it, and Spirit, you did mention the whole matter of eradication and aerial spraying. And so this is important. We also had the experience, I know Katia would have had the experience of going up into the mountains. We had it, there was some time ago, deforestation because of persons going up into the hills to cultivate. So climate change and climate justice is a real part of this conversation that we have to look at when we're looking at the whole global drugs policy and regulation or deregulation, legalization or not. So we need to spread the word to the various participants, to other persons, ask them to come join us. You can drop us an email as well for your own feedback on this session, as well as sessions before that you may be a part of. Or if you have any ideas for further research and study as we go forward with this issue, because development is critical across all areas, all regions. And you would have seen, read up, I know a number of, in the group, we would have posted a number of work that has been done by Professor Goodhand, work that has been done by TNI, work that has been done by ICCR. You can find them all online. So we ask that you join us, share with us your own thoughts on this series. Give us genuine feedback and join us for the other sessions. There may be things that I hope for those persons who are here from universities and colleges who are studying, that you would have found these sessions very informative, and that will lead you to materials that you can use for your own research. So we have 2 other sessions coming up: climate justice on the 2nd of December, and on the 10th of December, community participation is also there. So I'm asking that you come on board, and I thank you all for participating. This was a very interesting, inspiring conversation. Please remain a part of the process, whether it's the development, whether it's kind of drug policy, whatever it is. Thank you, and see you at our next session. Thank you all.